And if we can't walk in love, we're a noisy little gong, a bitter little song that a bully sings out of key. And if we can't walk in peace, we'll forget about the least of these. A mother crying on her knees for a boy who's locked away. There's a voice calling me.
This is Neighbors again. This is a podcast I do to have deeper conversations about civility in an increasingly divided America. And since I started the podcast, I had no idea that civility would even be called hate speech. So one of the questions that I'm sure some people are going to have, I'm like, oh, well, why are you talking about identity politics with two white people? It's because I just threw this out on Facebook and said I want to talk to somebody smart about this, and Craig was the first person that popped up, and we may well do another episode or two on this with some different voices. But this idea that like we need to fight over time in the podcast medium is silly because of the fact that we can do as many shows as we want to do here. So, if you don't like this one and you're smart, then just come on the podcast if you got something to say. If you're not smart, and I know that, sorry, you're out of luck. You can go start a Not Smart People podcast. I don't know. And I'm already probably starting out a little bit alienating. Craig and I grew up together. He was the first person that made me realize that I could write, and that was like a real possibility in life. And so he put out a book that did pretty dang well in I don't know, what was that, man? Like the mid to late 90s?
It wasn't that far back. It was 2003 it came out. 2003.
Okay. Gotcha. Well, that was right there where I realized that it was like possible to do it. So your book was on basically navigating your 20s from a Christian perspective. It's something I still have a copy of, and I think I probably stopped reading once I got out of my 20s because it kind of stopped being relevant.
Well, it makes for a good toaster too. So when you're done with it, you just put a drink on it. It's called 20-someone in case anyone's wondering, but yeah.
And then Craig actually lives now where I thought I was going to live at one point in life because I was interviewing for a job out there and then got it and didn't get to go because of a hiring freeze. Your school, it's technically called a headmaster in Montana, Bozeman, Montana?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Have you met John Mayer yet?
No, and I think earlier this summer we had Jeff Bridges downtown, but I drove by to try to see him and channel my best inner Lebowski, but I didn't find him.
Robert Redford lives in Bozeman, Montana as well. It's actually a really expensive place to live because a bunch of celebrity types have houses that they're only in like 6 weeks a year. And so amazing place. If you've never been to Yellowstone, if you've never been to Montana, you should do that before your life is over. Last thing before we get into the actual topic. So just give me kind of a 30,000 foot view on like what you do now and kind of why this topic interested you, and then I'll read the quote and we'll get going.
Yeah, well, based on your what you said at the beginning here, it sounds like you were looking for smart people. I just happen to be a fast one. So it has nothing to do with smarts. It has everything to do with I was first in line. But no, I think what I do as a headmaster here in Bozeman is I lead a school that we're trying to help students. It's a classical Christian school. We're trying to combine the best of Athens with the best of Jerusalem, so to speak, and be able to help students grow up with humility, grow up with critical, reasonable thinking, and then to be able to be rhetorically able to engage with the culture in a way that's not annoying. And I think the classical model and what we're trying to do is it really helps, I think, train students in some of these basic lost arts of the grammar, the dialectic, the rhetoric of living. And anymore, unfortunately, rhetoric's become a bit of a bad word. It's something that gets reduced to sound bites on Fox News or CNN, whatever, and that's how people think about it. And I think there's so much more if we truly understand the classical understanding of good rhetoric, good engagement, loving persuasion, as Aristotle would have defined the art of rhetoric. There's not a lot of loving persuasion going on, either of those two words. So I guess that was my interest.
Well, and oddly enough, not that this has to do with this topic, but just something I've been thinking about doing. I've been thinking about trying to get a group of business owners together on like a Tuesday at 6 a.m. every week to just read through classic philosophy, because I think that it opens your mind up to modern business so much. And, when you're just freaking out and chasing, profit scheme after profit scheme and then trendy management book after trendy management book, you burn yourself out and you annoy people, and there's a lot of stuff that's really good that's a few thousand years old. So it's been something I've been thinking through. Oddly enough, I unfortunately don't have time, but also haven't done as well, I don't think, in like a quote unquote book club where you just read fiction and kind of discuss it with people. I don't know anybody actually liked me in the book club, not as a person, but as a contributor anyway, because I don't think I was good at it. But there's something about philosophy that I think can help you in almost every single discipline. And that's why Greece and then later Rome built things that in turn built American democracy. There were some other nations in there as well. I would say that that the Dutch, with their kind of representational monarchy, also had a lot to do with the influence on modern United States. But my gosh, bottom line, if you take nothing else away, or if you stop here, if you want to just like make more money and have more people like you, which most people should like those things, just read some philosophy. It'll sharpen your mind. It'll help to undo the damage that I think modern social media does, which is make you flip from thing to thing to thing to thing to thing. You'll start to get some of that brain power back that you've been missing. So I'm going to go ahead and read the quote here. Okay. Democracy demands that we're able to get inside the reality of people who are different than us so that we can understand their point of view. Maybe we can change their mind, and maybe they can change ours. And this came from, Barack Obama speaking actually in South Africa, and created, I think he got a hall pass in a way, because he's still so beloved by a lot of people. And of course, some other people don't like him. But if anybody other than Obama had said this would have created more of a firestorm. And this is kind of going against what a lot of modern trends, and particularly a lot of modern trends in education that have popped up really since like 2015. It wasn't until about 2015 that I started hearing about like safe spaces and identity politics, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm surprised this wasn't more controversial. And I think it's because the people who would find it controversial don't want to have to deal with the fact that someone they liked so much said it.
Right. Well, and if you go back to 2015, so much of that controversy took place in my alma mater at the University of Missouri. And, there were so many things that came out of that. But I agree. I think there's people are careful, or they want to be careful with this quote, because conservatives, they don't want to give Obama credit for speaking truth. I mean, I think it's a very true, what he said, we need more of. Those, from opposite of that perspective, they don't necessarily want to grab onto that, because it seems like it flies in the face of so much of what their power structure is based on in terms of, the identity politics and those kinds of things. And that it's true on both sides. I mean, there's identity politics on both sides of the aisle. But I thought it was a great quote. I remember when I read it and I, heard about the speech, I actually linked the article, one of the articles. It may have been the same one that you linked, but I was really impressed with the quote and glad he said it and said, bring more. That's more of what we need, that message. I've taught some college as well, and would love to do that more in the future. I would say the next 10 years at least are pretty tied up for me, running a business, having a family, et cetera, et cetera. So I won't be back to it for some time, but can you recap exactly what happened at the University of Missouri to kind of kick off the whole identity politics era? And then I'll probably speak a bit into my experiences in the classroom. Sure. I don't know if I'm the best one to summarize. I mean, I followed it from a distance, obviously in Montana, but as I understand it, there were just a lot of the racial components that kind of met with the kind of an uber, what would you say? I hate using the terms conservative and liberal because they tend to pigeonhole so fast. But I think what happened was there was so much tension among some students and with faculty and things like that. And then the whole safe spaces came in. This was about the same time that things were going on at Yale. And you got this sense that people were just walking around offending one another every which way. And nobody liked that. But I mean, part of it is if you choose to be easily offended, you will be in our culture. And I think that that built on itself. And that's not to say that there weren't things that needed to be discussed, needed to be talked about and brought up. But what it escalated into, I think from my understanding, and again, I'm not too involved, having graduated, back when the Dead Sea was just sick. But, it's really taken a toll on the university from what I can tell.
And what was it? Was it like something like racist, like graffiti or something like that kicked it all off, or a conflict between a professor and a student? I'm trying to remember, and I was trying to look it up, and I can't even think what to Google there to like find where this came from.
Yeah, it was a combination of different things. I mean, there was it took place, I believe, in October. There was some graffiti. There was a protest at a parade, a homecoming parade, I think. There was a faculty member who was, in the name of safe spaces, really pointing the media and saying, you can't come here, and really saying some things that she ended up losing her job over, which was almost surprising a little bit, because that rarely happens, even for the most blatant of offenses at the university level. But it was really unfortunate, I think, for the university in terms of just this whole thing kind of escalated, and people at the highest echelon, I mean the president and everybody else, lost their jobs because everyone was looking to blame someone for what was going on, but nobody was talking to each other. They were yelling at each other, and they were but there's not, again, I'll go back to Aristotle, there wasn't a lot of loving persuasion going on. It was more of, I'm offended and somebody needs to know that. And there are reasons that they were, but at the same time, the way that the whole thing got handled, I would say, I'm not sure it really brought true resolution.
Yeah. I was thinking back through my own, and I was for the most part done teaching college by the time 2015 rolled around. I maybe taught one course. I think I taught a course in the spring of 2015, just one off, right? But I look back at like what a lot of probably the racial tensions bubbled up and that type of thing. And first of all, I think back and I think that, number one, I had enough emotional intelligence not to be an idiot and get myself into hot water over things that I probably should have said, but I knew I couldn't say in the modern space. So for one, I had, I was teaching broadcasting courses, and I had a gay student give the most, like, I don't know how else to say it, the most gay weather report ever. And the weather is just the weather. People just want you to just say it. And I knew I couldn't criticize that student or, really say much about it without putting myself at risk for really getting into trouble. So I just let it go, to the detriment of that student. Nobody's going to tell that student that in the hiring process, they're just not going to hire them. And I would say that, as far as careers that might discriminate against someone based on their sexual orientation, media is way down there. So that student wasn't in danger of not getting hired because they were gay. They were in danger of not getting hired because some of their reads were so bad. And I just couldn't... I looked at the cost, basically the risk analysis, and I'm like, okay, so I could lose my job, or I could just shut my mouth, and I guess that person will figure it out a little bit later, And so that was one side. The other side is that I taught for a for-profit college, and I, regularly got my classroom feedback, and I knew I could be a little more bold on some things because of my very high rating. And I knew that pretty much as long as I kept an average and didn't rock the boat too much, I could kind of do whatever I wanted. And so my thought was, part of my job as an instructor is to be hard enough on you that if you're not going to make it in the marketplace, you find that out before you get into the marketplace and can't get a job. And so there were students who really, really did not like me because I was really hard on them. I taught in the city and the burbs. So I taught downtown Chicago. A lot of kids that had grown up in a very urban context, and a couple times where I was like a white professor with pretty much an all black student body, and kind of this whole like safe spaces and you can't say this, microaggressions, etc. Most of that stuff can just be cleared up by just having some actual like social skills. A lot of it wouldn't be an issue if people weren't tone deaf, and then the overreaction to that tone deafness of like, oh, well, you can't say, because now, as you know, is supposed to be a microaggression. I would say that if I said, as you know, in a classroom setting, and somebody accused me of, quote unquote microaggression, and it wasn't my full-time income, that's a bridge too far. I would push that issue as far as I could, and either the student would wind up dropping it because it's ridiculous, nobody's actually hurt by the phrase "as you know," or I would get fired. And I could only say that because I was teaching part-time.
Well, the as you know, is that because you're making an assumption on them that their experience is the same as yours, or where is the offense there?
Well, apparently you're not supposed to say it at Yale now. So I'm not. I would assume that like you're assuming that their experience is the same as yours. So yeah, and I get it. Like I'm trying to think of one. I actually do believe in. And like microaggressions or whatever, I do think that there is something to that, for sure. Yeah. And I also think that, there are people who have been hurt, who have been kind of kicked around, particularly in the academia world, who haven't been understood, who, and now it's the overreaction, it's the French Revolution, where we're going to cut the heads off of everybody. And then all you wind up with is a depopulated nation, not a more peaceful one.
Right, and that's, I think, really a lot of the approach of what happened at Mizzou was this is the revolution. We're taking this campus, this country back, that kind of thing. And I'm not sure it's worked out quite as well for anybody in that regard.
Yeah. This is, I'll go ahead and give another example here, mildly at the risk of some of my own stuff. But, I just tried to run a feature on a movie that is not good. And I was told that, in that, like, objectively, I can point to several screenwriting books and say, this is why this movie is underperforming despite the very good reviews, is because it's got, like, very serious continuity issues. And whether or not it's trying to say something good, and actually I agreed with what the movie's trying to say. The movie, by the way, I'll go ahead and say it, is Sorry to Bother You. It starts out about code switching in the workplace, so how minorities have to kind of fit into more of a white box to be able to work, which I do think that the first half hour of the movie was great in what it had to say in the world of telemarketing. Then it switches into like this weird dystopian sci-fi thing. I won't quite spoil the ending because maybe you really do want to see it, but it goes from comedy to dystopian dark sci-fi in about 5 minutes, and it just doesn't work. It's got to be one of the worst films I've ever seen. And when I tried to run a feature like that, I wound up getting blocked by the management of an organization I write for, because they said that, well, you just can't have a white person criticizing a film of color like that. It's just not going to work right now. And my reply was, and again, hey, it's not my company. If it's your company, you can do whatever you want. I own a company. I'll do whatever I want in that company, and my the wisdom of my decisions will be reflected in my profits. But it's weird to be in a space where you can clearly prove you're objectively correct, and that's still not enough.
Well, that's, so much of the modern world. That's one of the things I think that's hard, even for us as a classical school, is, the three transcendentals that historically Western civilization has sought, truth, goodness, and beauty, all of those things are up for grabs now in terms of, when people talk about, I've seen Facebook posts or somebody will put up on their Facebook page that they're promoting their truth. And, this is, I'm telling my story, my truth, all of that is so much a function of the culture. And you just got caught in the midst of it as a writer, trying to objectively, as best you can, give your reasons. Reason doesn't play well. And so a lot of times, that if it can't be felt, it can't be heard. Yeah,
the whole live my truth thing. That's
the phrase. Live my truth.
So the worst example I have seen of that, of someone that leveraged it into celebrity, was an author named Glennon Doyle Melton, who wrote a couple books. I saw her speak one time. To be fair, I've never read any of your stuff because I just kind of wasn't into it when I saw her speak. But she wrote a couple books about basically overcoming addiction and having a pretty tough life or whatever, and resilience, which, I mean, hey, good for you. There's a lot of good books about resilience. I didn't read that one. And then she had a book about like family stuff coming out, and she found out her husband had been cheating on her pretty much their whole marriage. And in the course of a few weeks, she and her husband split up. He went with his paramour or whatever, and she wound up in a lesbian relationship with one of the U.S. women's national team soccer players, and then now they all have family dinners with her and her lesbian partner and her husband and the chick he was cheating with for years or whatever, and their 3 kids. And she's like, and the kids are awesome, and I had to live my truth. No, the kids are not awesome. The kids need therapy. Regardless of the orientation of your your relationship, you are utterly insane to think you can go from splitting up with someone to getting divorced to being engaged to someone else in under 6 months and it's going to be healthy. You guys are absolutely ruining your kids' lives. But she winds up on freaking Oprah and she was the one that was one of those live my truth people. The truth is, we can objectively measure that your kids are going to wind up being really screwed up, barring some outside influence. I don't care how good of a writer you are. We know what happens when the home is that unstable, and you're an idiot for thinking that you can go from divorced to a serious relationship in 3 months.
I wouldn't disagree. I mean, part of it we might want to think about. There's certainly a degree of foolishness, I think, with that. And
let me just. I don't think I framed that right. And I don't personally know her. Why would I worry about that when I got a business to run and a family of my own and stuff I need to do in my life? If it's just somebody doing that, I would say it's unfortunate, but I'm not going to comment on it. The only reason I'm commenting on it is because she went on Oprah and went on tour as a quote unquote family expert, and then just sort of flipped her message up on the fly to say this was all good, and is giving advice that psychology has, objectively proven is a terrible situation for children and adults to flourish. And that's the only reason. And it all falls into that live my truth banner. And it feels good and it has a nice pithy little ending. But what's going to happen is that your kids are going to get to college and realize that they really need some help adjusting because of what you did to them.
Yeah, I think that plays out. We see it every day in various hallways of schools and across the country, whether private, public, homeschool. The idea that our choices are not going to affect our kids. I've already screwed up my kids in ways that they don't even know yet. And I make the joke that we just want to make sure that our kids have plenty to talk about in therapy later. And our girls are great. We have 4 daughters, and God has really been merciful to us and to them having to live with us. But I think there's a degree of foolishness if we think those kinds of traumatic events, those kinds of significant shifts and changes and things like that aren't going to affect our kids. And the problem comes is we've added so much of celebrity to the mix as an attempt at justifying it. And so, if the goal is to end up on Oprah, woohoo, success. But your kids are going to grow up, and they've been affected by what got you to Oprah. And again, that's part of the unique mix and messiness, I think, and almost sickness of our entertainment-driven culture. How badly can I screw up my life and then get famous for it?
Yeah. Well, and if we can kind of connect all that to back to the original kind of microaggression, safe spaces stuff. The only way you can pull that off as Glennon Doyle Melton, and the only way that you can say that as you know is a microaggression, is that you completely live in an echo chamber and you don't have anybody else around you going, you might want to think about that. It is a less extreme version of Amy Winehouse, who is a brilliant singer. And, that song Rehab really was about the fact that her whole team, her management team, her booking agent, everybody told her she had to go to rehab or she was going to die. And she didn't. She fired all them. She wrote that song. It was a breakout hit. And within 2 years, she was dead. And so and because she found people around her that would tell her that her drug use was cool, that she was a good time to be around because of her drug use. And the same thing is true intellectually, and that's really what this podcast is. If you're only listening to people like you, odds are you're only becoming more extreme in your views and more angry, and nobody wins when you do that. And I actually think that this whole thing is going to have a 3 to 5 year run, and it's going to burn itself out. Like, I don't think in 10 years we're going to be talking about microaggressions and safe spaces.
Well, I don't know if I agree.
Oh, why go for it? Why is that?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it sure seems like things are going to get worse before they get better, and maybe that's the span of that is going to be shorter than I think it's going to be, or than you think it's going to be. I think as long as people are. I just read an article yesterday in Psychology Today about the trouble that college students are having with resilience on a college campus, and the impact that that's having on the college faculty and staff, and in terms of trying to help and deal with that. I guess I don't see a lot of that getting better anytime soon, or kind of fading out of the conversation, just because I think we're so consumed with the behaviors and the repercussions of it that we're still not really talking about what's at the root of some of this. Why everybody yes has the rights to do this. Everyone talks about the rights. Very few talk about, okay, what are our responsibilities in having these rights? And I don't know. I hope you're right. I hope less than 5 years some of this fades out, but color me skeptical, I guess.
Okay. I guess I just don't know where I think it's gonna go. I had a conversation on the podcast with a friend of mine that, or not a friend, I actually had to say somebody I really don't like and I'll never have on again, that, I said, okay, so I applied for a job at a very prestigious firm in Chicago that kind of has a global name, and I was not getting a call back, even though I was, I'm not an Ivy Leaguer by any means, but I've got 2 earned master's degrees and I have a very good resume behind me. And this is before I started a business. And I was just like, well, what the heck? I don't get this. I don't get why we can't move the ball here. And my friend said, well, just pretend to be gay because they have a LBGT first thing. So just tell them you're gay, and then afterwards you can tell them you got straight. I don't know. That you're bisexual and you're currently in a straight relationship. He's like, that'll get you through. And so I had a guy on the podcast that said, when we were talking about this stuff, it's like, hey, I get it. I do think that diversity hiring sometimes is a good thing. And I just talked about this on my business podcast, The Consultant and the Millennial. The most benign example everybody could probably not be offended by, so you can kind of hear me on this, is that I know companies in Chicago that only hire from Harvard, Stanford, Yale. And what happens is they wind up with a bunch of people who went to literally the same school of management, and they're always going to come to the same conclusion, oftentimes to their detriment. If I were in a position like that, I came up, I had 3 jobs by the time I was 18 years old. We're from the second poorest county in the state of Illinois. I have a very different scrapper mentality on getting things done than somebody that, their parents helped them get a prestigious internship and they got into an Ivy because of legacy admissions. Not saying that they don't have stuff I don't have, but I have stuff they don't have. And so, diversity hiring, particularly if you have a product that's going to a diverse set of customer base, I think actually does benefit your business. But it gets to be crazy if I can't even get a call back because I'm not LGBT. And so I asked another guest, like, oh, well, don't you think that's a little nuts, or am I not at least be allowed to be upset that the only reason I'm not getting a call back and they're not even finding a gay candidate is because of the fact that I'm straight? And he's like, no, you're not allowed to be upset over that. I'm like, okay.
Right. Yeah, you don't. That's not something. It applies one way and it doesn't apply another.
Well, at that point, we're back to the French Revolution. Why don't you guys just kill me and take my things, and then you won't have to compete against me?
Well, you're asking, where does this go? I don't. I guess in my mind, I wonder to what degree. How far away are we from that? If some of the angst of the country, just doesn't resolve, or there's not some new wave of hope that's coming in, or new modeling. I mean, we talk about all the problems that we see in schools with kids, and bullying is the buzzword. We could do a whole other podcast on that if you wanted to, but where do you think the kids are learning this?
Yeah.
I mean, where is this being modeled for them? Well, every night on the news, every night in their, it works its way into the sitcoms. It works its way into just the interactions that their parents are having with people at work or people at home, people driving. You're driving along and somebody just flips you the bird because they're angry and you don't even know what you did. But again, those are the things that I just wonder, where does this go? I don't see it going in a good place if it continues.
Well, there is also this kind of counter movement to it, and the reason I think maybe it burns quickly is because where's Occupy Wall Street at right now?
Sure, but that was wouldn't you say that was so much more of a central or localized or regionalized kind of thing?
Yeah,
I don't know.
Well, and maybe there's a new level or a new kind of place of outrage culture. What I see particularly with colleges is you can push really hard. And again, like, I'm moderately for some of this stuff. I'm for, some of this stuff in moderation. When I'm talking about, safe spaces and microaggressions in particular, there's validity there. However, when you're able to push your college to tailoring your education to exactly what you want it to be, to where nothing offends you and you're not challenged, what's going to happen is that you're going to get in the job market and nobody's going to want you because you're a spoiled little brat. And I'm talking about somebody who, has a new company, so I'm going to have to hire younger as I add full-time employees, and I'm going to have to hire probably pretty close to being out of college. I'm talking 23, 24-year-olds is what I'll be able to afford is a new business, until I can, and then I'm either going to have, honestly, I'm not going to be able to afford absolute top-notch talent, so I'm going to have to grow it. I'm going to have to find people who have a lot of potential and help them come up in their careers, and then as the company grows, pay them more and treat them great so they'll stay with me, God willing, right? And I think that there will be a trend that, as grads are getting out, and they find out that their degree was worthless because they got everything they wanted and they're completely unprepared for the workforce. There is going to be natural repercussions to that's going to make people think the other way. And I also think that the smash success of Jordan Peterson is only about the fact that that he's preaching personal responsibility in an era where everybody thinks they're owed something, or they're special, or they were damaged, and they deserve a special lane. And he's saying, clean your own room before you try to change the world. I think that blowback, I'm seeing a lot of people in their early 20s who are really into that message across a diversity of kind of viewpoints and political ideologies.
Yeah, it's certainly countercultural, I think, to the way many have grown up in that regard. And it's not like it's a new message particularly. It's just that it's so stark compared to what the culture has taught and preached, and modeled to the students growing up. And so I do think that that's part of the attraction. He says some things. He speaks a lot of true things. I would say he knows the law. I don't know if he knows grace that much, but I appreciate him taking the stand on the things that he's said.
Yeah. By the way, the law, the grace, that would be Christian language for those of you who are not of the faith. Well, let me dive in a little bit right there, because, when we talk about privilege, there probably is no bigger, one of the biggest variances in privilege is just like if you had good parents or not. I look at people even across the street, this guy was yelling at his kids so much. I walked out there to see if I was going to call the cops, because I could hear it 100 yards away, or maybe take other actions, which I'm not going to cop to on the podcast. That is a tremendous amount of privilege. I would say that my advantage in life, and most people wouldn't see this as an advantage, my mom's family was great. My dad hates me. I would say my dad probably really started hating me when I was about 12 years old. And that combination of having to overcome and having amazing support made me stronger and more resilient, and I think probably much wealthier than most people, because I had this weird mix of like great and and somebody that probably regretted the fact that I existed, and that helped me win. And later I went to counseling, so I wasn't crazy, but that helped me win. So we are absolutely all coming from like different points on the playing field, and I think that it needs to be acknowledged that if you're in a bad school and you don't have parental support, if you're from a single parent household, you're in a bad school, you're in a single parent household where, your mom's working 2 to 3 jobs to keep the lights on, and you don't have any like networking to rich people to show you how to make money, which I've had a tremendous advantage in. My personal kind of network is in the billions of dollars of people that I talk to about business stuff that are helping me grow. They're just friends, because I'm super extroverted and just randomly start talking to somebody and it winds up being a literal billionaire who's been pretty helpful to me. If you don't have those things, we pretty much know how it's going to turn out. There's going to be a Ben Carson once in a while that studies his way out. So that is a legitimate thing we need to talk about as far as like privilege and that type of thing. On the flip side, this quote unquote privilege thing of like, oh, well, your parents did one thing you didn't like, and somebody said something to you in college that made you uncomfortable. Those are not conversations about privilege we need to have. Those are conversations we need to have about you not being a wuss.
Yeah, and I think the community, and that's essentially what you're talking about, is the group of people who are around you as you grew up. That's a huge dynamic that's missing from so many lives. Even at a classical Christian school here, we still talk about the importance of the family, of the church, of the school, and when families maybe make the mistake of saying, "Oh, we think of the school as kind of our church." I'm like, whoa, that's not a good thing. We're a bridesmaid to the church. We're not the bride. And the thing that I've seen is students who graduate and go on and I think prosper, they have those 3 elements in place. But we as a school, even, or just a church in itself, just a family, it's just a lot harder when you take those other elements out, because those things have been put in place by design. That's really where when we talk about identity, we get our identity from without, not from within. And I think that's the thing that we think about, oh, I'm going to go on a vision quest for 10 years and find out who I really am. That doesn't necessarily help you, because you're not taking into consideration all of the people around you who have been placed there to help tell you who you are and to help you be able to respond and learn in that context, which I think your story illustrates.
Yeah, and I have much higher standards for myself than I think most people have, and I wound up in kind of therapy for a second time in my late 20s, and I was wrestling with the fact that I was kind of a loser, and at the time, I had, from the outside, a very, I would say, by all measurable accounts, it looked like I was being successful in my career. I was knocking out a second graduate degree because it was free. But I am the grandson of collectively this like generation that, my grandpa had to drop out of school in 8th grade because he was an orphan, and he butchered 15 hogs a day to make it, and him and everybody else in town went off to World War II and, were decorated and came back and were just these pillars of a community. And at the time I was in my late 20s, I was single, I was playing, I really had no idea how to make a relationship work. I was, looked like I was successful on the outside, but I was totally playing defense and miserable in my job. And, and cool, I got some more school done. I'm good at school. That's not scary or hard. The reason I was a loser is because I wasn't being proactive and making myself or the world a better place. And I knew that that the people 2 generations, above me would have done a lot more with what I had in my hands. And oddly enough, at 35, it took me a while to correct course. I don't feel like that. I feel like I matter. I feel like I'm in a position where I'm using what I have, right? But I was a loser, even if people didn't understand that. And the only way I was able to do that and hopefully be in a place now where my life matters to, my family and my community with what I'm doing is because I had really good examples. And if people don't have those examples, you can't expect them necessarily to come to that same conclusion.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's part of what, going back to this topic of, where we are in civil conversation, people learn that when they experience it and when they see it. You can read books on it. You can, aspire to have these conversations yourself. But I think we need to be able to recognize how important our examples are to our kids. I mean, even the way we relate, when somebody offends us in Walmart or, wherever we're going, our kids are going to watch to see how we respond. And we can say, oh, well, I'm completely justified. And we may be in wanting to do something really retributive, is that a word? Retributive toward that. But I think, again, what are we teaching our kids? We're saying one thing, we're doing another. And I think that's part of why we've gotten in this mess, is that the virtues that really, have shaped the founding of our country were present in its, in its ideals. We don't even know what those are anymore. I just read a book. I just want to throw this out real quick for you. I don't know if you've read this. This is Alexis de Tocqueville's America, or Democracy in America. I read the first volume of it leading up to 4th of July this summer. And it's just really fascinating to read his thoughts on our country from 1835, when he was here observing it, and just how we've changed, and now we haven't changed at all, and for better or for worse. It's really interesting just to hear his. But let me read you this quote, Seth, and then you can do what you want. But he says, in my opinion, all the reasons which tend to maintain a democratic republic in the United States fall into 3 categories. The first is the peculiar and accidental position in which Providence has placed the Americans. The second comes from their laws. The third derives from their usages and customs. And by that, he essentially means our culture. And, my hope is that as parents consider their own interactions, even at the smallest of levels, they would really get and understand, I'm being watched, and I'm going to be imitated by my kids, and we're missing that piece so much.
Well, and that's, I guess, when we talk about the overreaction, or the aggression of, kind of the microaggression, safe space thing, it's kind of the natural outgrowth when you mix some legitimate grievances with a generation that, was raised on self-esteem rather than achievement.
Yeah.
That I feel good because I accomplished something difficult, and as opposed to I feel good for the sake of feeling good, which is just never going to hold. Right. And so by that standard, it's not, it's expected, I guess, that something like this was going to come up. Like, if we didn't teach kids to aspire to something beyond themselves, beyond their own happiness.
Where I see it playing out is the shift in parenting that has gone from being a coach, mentor to our kids, to now being feeling like we have to be a protector.
Yep.
And what that shift does is, and I'm not saying that there aren't legitimate, I mean, part of it comes out of the fact that we live in a sicker society. You know, there are more things that parents feel they have to protect their kids from. I mean, whether it's, you know, just being able to walk home from school or pedophilia or whatever it is. But that mindset has really done an overreach where, you know, now you have parents calling universities on behalf of their kids, wanting to make sure that the university is doing a good job removing the snow so junior doesn't fall into I'm not making this up. This happened.
Oh, no. I was
State,
28 teaching a college course, and a 25-year-old's mom called me. If you listen to the business show and this show, you're probably sick of me using that example because I've used it in business a couple times. But there's something wrong. I mean, you have drastically failed as a parent if you're running interference for your 25-year-old at that point.
Right. And it's, you know, by that time, it's really in many ways too late. And if we're not helping our kids learn how to advocate for themselves with their teachers, with their other peers, you know, at younger ages, when they're in middle school and upper school, that's where they learn it, and that's where they build confidence. And our goal is to come around and coach them through it, to process with them, you know, basically to parent them, to mentor them. That's what we're supposed to be doing. But what happens is, you know, Mama Bear jumps in because the cub has had a bad day. What does that teach everybody involved? What does that reinforce in her life, in her child's life, in the school's life, and, you know, whatever other conflict that they're having? We're not maturing. You know, our goal is to raise adults, not children. Yeah. And I think sometimes we forget about that. Yeah. What the goal really is.
Yeah, and I look at kind of where I wound up in life, and, you know, I look at the fact that, I mean, first of all, I was a pretty good kid, so you kind of got to earn this as a child. But when I was 16 and wanted to go to a student government leadership, I was on student council or whatever, wanted to go to a student government like leadership conference, and nobody else in the school would go. My mom just let me take off and go 6-7 hours in an era where, you know, the cell phone only worked for about the first 3. And then I just went dark, right? Like I had to find a payphone and call her and tell her I made it or whatever. You know, I was 16. I was allowed to take off, go through Chicago, and handle all that stuff. And it just wasn't, you know, a big deal. There's a lot of small steps that got me there, but there's a big difference in being allowed to drive an interstate trip alone a few months after you got your license and being, you know, 25 and having your mom have to call and say that they need to remove the snow. You know, and it's oddly enough in Europe, they're actually putting kind of dangerous toys, not dangerous, but toys with some risk back on playgrounds because they found out that kids actually need to fall down and get hurt a little bit if they're going to grow into mature adults.
Yeah, because we've taught risk avoidance, you know, not risk management, not, you know, evaluating, okay, does this make sense? Is this good or bad? If the kid doesn't get a couple of those bruises, and again, I'm not talking about just being completely negligent, but you look at the way all the playgrounds have been designed. You know, everything is soft. There's absolutely no risk because of the litigious element of our culture. Nobody wants to get sued. Yeah, but that's exactly right. We're not teaching kids how to evaluate risk or even deal with it or recover from it, you know, if it goes bad. And I think those are some of the things that culturally, again, it's been done with the best of intentions, but intentions are often misplaced.
Yeah, let me kind of point us in a couple directions as we start to land the plane here. The first one we talked about Jordan Peterson being such a phenomenon right now, and I would not say like I'm pointing to this person as like the only voice you should be listening to or anything. I think it's very interesting. I think if nothing else, he's worth reading so that you understand that somebody like that's preaching personal responsibility is only possible to be a phenomenon in an era where kind of the microaggression, safe space, I'm special era has like run amok and run out of control. But one thing that I wish more people would grab onto from his book is, if you want to change the world, clean your own room. And that is very that's very Aristotelian. Like, it's very classical Greek thought. If you can't master your own stuff, why should you expect to have a voice in in the public arena when there's debates going on? And a lot of what this whole like virtue signaling, microaggression, outrage culture is I see a problem in society. I don't want to be personally burdened or inconvenienced in any way to change it, so I'm going to yell. And that gets to where I'm writing for a company that is just afraid of the Twitter outrage, even though they agreed with what I wrote or whatever, right? And so it is very easy to yell on Twitter. It is much harder to say, okay, there is a situation where, some people have a much harder time getting jobs, networking, being able to climb up kind of the prosperity ladder than others. So I'm going to go out and think up a product where I can, have a business where I can give like 16-year-olds in, poor rural America or poor urban America a chance to have a job and learn some life skills to where they can go out and change their future. Even if they came from a bad school situation, I'm going to be more patient and have a business model that works for that, which is something I'm thinking about a lot right now, is how do I start businesses that create jobs that change people for the better? That's a lot harder and it takes a lot more time, and most people just don't want to do it. And so it feels good to yell, sort of like it feels good to be to support Glennon Doyle Melton's live your truth even though it's flying in the face of science. So that would be the first thing, maybe the takeaway here is, microaggression, safe space stuff. If you want to complain about it, try to find a high school or college student and get in their lives and see why they think like that and point them in a direction that's going to make them more successful than just, going crazy over that.
Yeah, the phrase that I use and talk with the kids about is how are you thinking beyond your nose? How are you thinking for and on behalf of someone else rather than just what's in it for me? What's this going to benefit me with? Why do I have the gifts that I have? How am I going to use them? Finish the question, how am I going to use them for the good of others, for the flourishing of humanity? I think those are the things we just have to help kids be able to broaden their perspective a little bit. And part of it is for us to broaden our own. We're so preoccupied as adults with our own little worlds. And, it does start with us in many ways. And I would agree with Peterson in that regard. Yeah.
When you read de Tocqueville there, one thing that's so fascinating to me that I actually just recently learned, and I, kind of been a American Revolution kind of person who's very interested in that for a long time. George Washington was actually upset that his estate was not burned. The British were going to burn it, and somehow somebody on the estate negotiated against kind of the British kind of the British idea of like royals or whatever, saying it would be offensive for you to burn the home of a leader. And Washington felt like everybody else basically lost their fortunes, lost their homes, who were fighting, and the fact that he didn't was a bad example to the people he was leading, and he thought that was a bad thing. There's a very far cry from starting like that, like I'm willing to lose my home and my life because I will not subject my children to what people don't realize is how brutal the British government was. They killed 5 times as many civilians during the war as they killed soldiers. So I'm going to die and lose everything I have so that my kids don't have to live under that kind of oppression. There's a big difference from that to like, I deserve things, I want it, and or I see somebody else that's having a hard time, and the way I'm going to help them is by taking things from other people in a way that's not that doesn't hurt me in any way. There's a big difference in like civic engagement there.
Yeah, for sure. It's a great story. I hadn't heard that about Washington. Yeah. It lines up with other stories I've heard about Washington. I mean, who he was as a leader, as a first president.
So have you had, I guess I didn't ask you personally, and I don't know how much you can speak to this as a principal, but like when you're, like, is this a discussion that, maybe a better way to say it is it happening at the high school level? Like, are we talking about microaggressions in safe space? Not necessarily your school, but I know people, who are heads of schools go to conferences and stuff, because my college roommate's a principal. So,
Yeah, I mean, in terms of, I mean, this is big in the public government school curriculum and discussions, training, those kinds of things. I think we try to, as a private Christian school, we probably use some different language. I mean, I think putting it in the context of what is Christian kindness, what is Christian goodness. What does this mean? As when Jesus talks about loving your neighbor as yourself, that's language that we're always talking with the students about, and I think it's trying to deal with some of the root issues underneath. Why is it that this doesn't seem to bother you? In Montana, where we are, you've been here. There's a racially diverseness that doesn't really exist.
Yeah.
And so we have to work, I think, to be able to talk about, yes, the importance of understanding race that's different from your own, but then also helping kids recognize their own prejudices in a lot of other areas, and so it goes beyond just race. It goes beyond, there's a socioeconomic element, there's the educational element, there's all those different things. And I think it's trying to help kids get at what is it that in your mind you're thinking that there's a superiority to someone else, for whatever reason. So it's trying to get at that. I think we're dealing with that at more of a heart level, whereas I think some of what plays out in more of the public schools tends to be more at a behavioral level, because they want it to stop. But really, I don't know if they have the opportunity to be able to address what's causing those behaviors. And so, you get a lot of behavioralism more in the public school in that regard.
Yeah, and, the idea that you're just going to be the pure one that has no prejudices or whatever, and I've used this example in other podcast episodes, but I would say that there's a couple of European immigrant groups that I tend to probably bump heads with a little bit more in the Chicago area. And,
Sure.
as part of my extended family's from Laos. So it's not like, it's not like I'm anti-immigrant. I have more trouble with a couple cultures that are prominent in the Chicago area as far as immigrant groups, and tend to probably be a little more distrustful when I hear people speaking a couple languages from Europe in particular. I just have to be aware of that and realize it's probably never going to completely go away, and that changes as I kind of get to know some more stories out of those two respective countries.
Yeah.
But the idea that you're ever going to be completely free from prejudice is kind of silly. And then that goes back to, if that was happening, kind of this whole University of Missouri kind of microaggression safe spaces thing, probably we would have cooled it off before it ever went crazy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and again, I think it comes back to where are our blind spots? Where are we fooling ourselves? And again, the only way we're going to get at that is really having people around us in our community saying, "Hey, I'm not sure that was the most edifying, that was the most encouraging in terms of what you spoke about, this particular group, or the way that you speak about this." I mean, we need people to point those things out to us and to be open to those kinds of things, because we're never going to, all of us are carrying those kinds of realities, those defenses, because they're defense mechanisms in some regard. That doesn't mean they're good ones, but a lot of times without other intervention, we'll just, if left alone in the corner, I can convince myself of just about anything.
Yeah,
and I've got to have people around me.
Well, and let me drop this in here as we wrap up. I remember a moment in college where I was just like, I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to do, because when I do say something, I tend to lean towards the side of aggression. And this was a woman that said this, and I knew I couldn't yell at a female student as a male student. And that wasn't a good idea. But it was in a film class, and the female student said, well, maybe there's not as many, kind of black films because of there's not as much talent there or something like that. And the student actually came from Pekin, Illinois, which has been a place with a KKK kind of activity for 50 plus years. Up until the 1990s, their mascot was actually called the Pekin Chinks, which is it's crazy that we're talking like 1992. There's a high school called the Pekin Chinks, so like a stereotypical little Chinese person. And I remember being super offended. I remember there's a black student in there. That's way beyond microaggression. That's like macroaggression. And so this did come from, this definitely came from somewhere. And I didn't yell because I thought I'd get in trouble for just yelling at somebody. But like, if we would have had those conversations sooner, we wouldn't be in this boat. And I think now maybe the place that we kind of come to agreement on is like reasonableness and trying to calm things down. Actually, hopefully we'll start to temper the insanity here, whether or not this movement burns itself out or gets bigger.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the more that we can model that, take bold steps in small ways, I think that's the way this is going to hopefully change and wear itself out. Because not because we've just endured to get through it, but because we've tried to change it and we've resolved that we are not going to go forward like this anymore. Because I don't know if we can. I just don't know I don't know how far we can really go if some of this doesn't change.
So I actually think the last question, the people who have seen this conversation probably might be interested in it. Are you ever going to so you did one book and you kind of talked about how you didn't want to be like the generations guy, right? Last time we hung out. So you kind of didn't wind up doing a book on your 30s or whatever, and you didn't want to be a person with a book about each decade. Have you thought about the kind of When Athens Meets Jerusalem book? Because I think people would be interested in reading that. And I don't know that anybody has necessarily put it out there like that. And let me say, for people who have no faith or, or pretty anti-religion, you have to understand that objectively, you don't get to American democracy without Judeo-Christian thought mixed with Greek and Roman philosophy. I mean, that's how we got here, and we have a society that certainly has a lot of things to work on, but also has created something that's pulled more people out of abject poverty globally than anything else in human history.
Well, to your question, that book that book has been written.
Oh, has it?
Yeah, not by me, but
okay.
A guy named, but it's worth reading. A guy named John Mark Reynolds. He's an acquaintance of mine, but the title of the book is When Athens Meets Jerusalem, something along those lines, and it's definitely worth a read. To your point, I think that. And Tocqueville talks about this again. Let me just quote this for you, because he says it so much better than I could. He says, Americans so completely identify the spirit of Christianity with freedom in their minds, it's almost impossible to get them to conceive the one without the other. This is not one of those sterile ideas bequeathed by the past to the present, nor one which seems to vegetate in the soul rather than to live. I think the thing that I so appreciate about the founding of our country, and again, I don't come from the perspective that we're a Christian nation. I never have. But the influence of the greatest thoughts of Western civilization coming out of and as part of this religious background and Christian perspective, it's worth investigating. It's worth looking at. And Reynolds' book would be a good one, John Mark Reynolds. But yeah, I do think that the two have gone hand in hand and have birthed a wonderful thing. I think the question is, how are we helping it grow as it grows up? And we've got plenty of work to do for sure. Yeah,
and to get back to the Obama quote about sometimes they change our minds, sometimes we change ours. I think that kind of what's been threaded through this whole conversation is when that doesn't happen, when be it the alt-right or the white identity politics or the pretty far left kind of movement that's happening right now, the more those two sides both push, the more they're going to find kind of people who would otherwise be pretty reasonable, I think. They're going to push people into the other camp. So it's like, oh my gosh, well, if you're going to say this in higher ed, I guess I'm just going to go be all right and protect my, white European culture or whatever. It's like, oh, well, if you're going to be racist, then, we're going to be justified in, riots or, whatever. Well, if you're going to be justified in riots, then we're going to be justified in, the Charlottesville stuff, because you pushed us to it. And eventually what we wind up with is just murders. If not, it's hard for me to imagine in the next 10 years a situation where we have a quote unquote civil war like a lot of people were talking about, because there's still a lot of fail safes in place to prevent that. But I think what we wind up with is a lot more civic unrest and just random murders.
Sure. Well, and here's my last thought, Seth, and you can wrap it up. But I would love for us as a nation, as a group of people, to spend a lot more time, rather than talking about who's right, let's spend a lot more time talking about what's right. And I think if we could shift that conversation a little bit, less worried about which groups believe what and that kind of thing, but again, what are the virtues? What are the things? And virtues go beyond values. Values are just the personal opinions. What are the virtues that historically have been so important to Western civilization? Can we talk about what's right rather than who's right? I think the conversation would be a better one for us and for the future.
So you got anything you want to shout out here? I give people a platform. Most people probably aren't going to move to Montana, so they probably can't go to your school. I mean, obviously, I asked you if you're going to write that book. I would say that, there's, I think you've probably got some more work in you. I mean, what do you want to do now?
That's a good question. I'm just trying to be, faithful in what I'm doing here. We've got a school of about 200 kids, pre-K through 12th grade, and I just want to see them equipped for not to run from a world, but to engage it, and to be able to do so in a way that is honoring to people and to God. And I don't know. I don't have too many more aspirations than that right now. So if you shoot me some idea, maybe here's an aspiration, is maybe to get asked back to do another podcast. We'll have to see how this goes. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks for the opportunity.
You're about a third of the fact that I've ever had a writing career, so I'm pretty sure that's going to go.
Well, that's enough for me. So I'll just put that on my tombstone.
Okay.